Okay, welcome back to Mrs. B Reads. We are working on Something Upstairs by Avi, and this is chapter 3 on page 34. This book is so good. Kenny is certain that it wasn't the alarm that woke him, but sounds coming from the small room. Heart pounding, he checked the clock. It was a little past 2. Hastily, he turned the alarm switch off and listened. Another sound came. It was the same he had heard before, an irregular scratching and scraping noise. A thought struck him. The ghost, if it was a ghost, wanted him to wake up. Kenny slipped out of bed quickly, but quietly, and made his way across the attic. He had left the door to the little room slightly open. Taking a deep breath, he reached out to give it a tug. It swung open half an inch more, enough so he could look in. The ghost boy was already there, straining upward from the glowing stain. Soon he stood in the middle of the room, his back to Kenny, glowing like smoldering dark brown earth. As he had done before, the ghost moved to the far wall, then felt its surface as though trying to find a way to escape. Gradually, he worked around the room until once more the two boys were facing each other. This time, the ghost's look showed no emotion, certainly no inclination to speak. And although Kenny had the feeling that it was the ghost who had summoned him, he decided that if he wanted to talk, he'd have to start it. "Who are you?" he whispered. The ghost inclined his head a little. Kenny wasn't even certain he had heard. He said nothing, only shifted very slightly as though he could hear better with one ear than the other. Kenny tried again. "Please," he said, "if you can't tell me your name, I'd like to know what you are." The ghost pointed down to the stain. Kenny's eyes followed the gesture. "I don't understand," he said. "Does the stain have something to do with you?" At that point, the ghost gave Kenny something like a nod. He even turned around, showing off the stain on his back. "I'm not getting it," Kenny said. "Can you talk?" Hold on 1 second. Yes, okay, sorry, just making sure I'm in the right place. The ghost's mouth opened. He seemed to be trying to say something. It didn't come. He tried again. This time he managed to utter one sound and one alone. It was hollow, indistinct, as if he had forgotten how to speak. "What?" Kenny said. The ghost repeated the sound. To Kenny, the sound or word, he didn't know what it was, sounded like Ave, or perhaps save. He repeated it to himself once, twice, 3 times. Suddenly it came. "Oh," he blurted out, "slave." The word, flung out so suddenly, seemed to strike the ghost with enormous power. He retreated to the farthest wall, lifted his arms as if to protect himself. Kenny saw that he had said something terribly wrong. Wanting to apologize, but not knowing how, he took a step forward, reaching for the ghost boy to reassure him. But to Kenny's dismay, the ghost didn't understand the gesture. Instead, he cringed back and, like melting ice, sank into the floor, leaving the room dark and as empty as it had been before. Next morning, Kenny slept late, missing his parents at breakfast. When he finally came downstairs, he found a note informing him when they would be at home and asking him please to call one of them at work. But before he could call, the phone rang. He thought it would be his mother, but it was the pharmacist. "The lab has identified what caused the stain," she told Kenny. "Oh, right," he said. "What was it?" "Blood. Human blood." Kenny was not surprised. "From long ago?" he asked. "Yes, exactly." "How long?" "More than 100 years. Otherwise, they would have to report it to the police." "Any way to be more exact?" "Apparently not." After breakfast, Kenny called his mother and told her he was going over to the historical library. Willinghast was waiting for Kenny. He was pleased, he said, that he had returned. In his formal way, he told Kenny that he had some information, not much perhaps, but some about the names on the list. Kenny said, "I think I only care about the ones from more than 100 years ago." Willinghast looked up. "May I ask why?" "They'd be the most interesting ones," Kenny said evasively. Evasive means he's trying to avoid it. Willinghast considered him carefully. Kenny insists the old man must have known he was not being completely candid, which means honest. After a moment, Willinghast said, "Permit me to share with you the full extent of my investigation." He slid a paper over the desk. Next to each name, a line of information had been provided. Williams family, 1636 to 1743, land used farming. Sheldon, 1743 to 1769, merchant. That means they bought and sold goods. Stillwell, 1769 to 1845, Chandler, house built in 1789. Blaisdell, 1845, 1849, merchant, went to California in the gold rush. Lawton, 1849 to 1867, sea captain. Lake, 1867 to 1890, banker. Vicky, 1890 to 1912, merchant. Butter, 1912 to 1929, lawyer. Myers, 1929 to 1930, baker. Salazar, 1930 to 1947, carpenter. Flood, 1947 to 1963, professor. Melton, 1963 to 1987, veterinarian. Kenny studied the names and the information. Can you tell me which ones might have had slaves, he asked. Willinghast gave him an intense look. Slaves, he said, speaking the word with disdain, which means he doesn't like it, in like a snooty way. I mean, Kenny said, do you think any of them owned slaves? It is possible. When did they outlaw slavery? Kenny asked. You are asking about Rhode Island, I presume? Yes. Willinghast sat back. No more slaves, he began, were to be brought into the state after 1774. In 1784, a new law was passed. Those who had been slaves remained so, while their children born after that time remained slaves only until they reached the age of 21. It was a most liberal position. Liberal means free thinking and sort of forward thinking. Of course, eventually, all slavery was prohibited by amendment of the federal Constitution. But before that, said Kenny, trying to remember references he had read, wasn't slavery very important to the state? The trade brought riches to some, Willinghast allowed. Weren't there people, Kenny continued, who wanted to get rid of slavery? There are always those, the old man agreed, who desire to rush history. What do you mean? Oh, Willinghast said vaguely, agitators and the like. May I inquire as to why you are so interested in the subject? Kenny replied, just am. Could kids be slaves? I believe I just informed you about that. Well, how can I find out which of those people on that list had a kid for a slave? I have serious doubts that you can. More to the point, I assure you, it's not worth the bother. Kenny looked over the paper again. It gave him too much information and too little all at once. He didn't know what to make of it or where to begin. He tried another approach. What, he said, about murders? Murders, said Willinghast. Some color came into his pale cheeks. His eyes were fixed on Kenny. If someone got murdered, Kenny continued blithely, would it be in, say, newspapers? I mean, they didn't have TV or radio or anything like that, but you know what I'm saying? Like, would it have been reported? Is it a slave who might have been murdered that has caught your interest? I think so. Willinghast shook his head. Hardly likely that such a thing would have been reported. Why? Willinghast shrugged. It was not considered important. How come? The man made an open gesture with his hand. My boy, we're talking about slaves. He spoke as if the word explained his meaning. Trust my judgment. It's not something I would worry about. If I were you, I should cease your search, which means stop. When the ghost boy appeared that night, Kenny, still dressed, was waiting, standing in the dark by the door to the small room. Kenny watched, fascinated, as the ghost heaved himself free of the glowing floor, like a swimmer coming out of the water after a long pull, grabbing the end of a dock, hauling himself to shore. Once up, the ghost approached the far wall and, as before, began to search it. Kenny said, Are you looking for a way out? He had made up his mind to speak softly, not wanting to alarm the boy as he had done the night before. The ghost stopped and turned, bestowing on Kenny a clear gaze of contempt. Then he continued his search. Kenny decided to say nothing else, waiting instead for him to make his way around the room until they would face one another again. Sure enough, when the ghost came to Kenny's side of the room, he paused. His look, unmistakably angry now, was baffling to Kenny, but the pause did allow him to notice more about the figure, the scar on his left cheek, and the fact that, though the ghost was shorter than he appeared to be older. I think I should tell you, Kenny said. I'm living here now. We just moved into the house. Those words made the ghost's eyes narrow slightly. He backed up a step. Emboldened, Kenny went on. You were a slave, he said. Is that what you meant to say when I asked you yesterday? The ghost considered him carefully. Then he said, I am a... He didn't finish. A what? Kenny coaxed. A slave. You mean you were a slave? The ghost shook his head. No. Now. I don't understand. The ghost pointed down. Blood, Kenny said, to which the ghost added, mine. And he returned to exploring the walls with increased urgency. You don't have to do that, Kenny suggested. The door is open. You can see that, can't you? I mean, I won't prevent you from leaving or anything like that. The ghost halted his search and looked at Kenny with intense suspicion, but then he did turn to the door. Kenny backed out of the way. Come on, he urged. The ghost shook his head. I cannot. Why? It is forbidden. By whom? I am a slave. There are no more slaves, Kenny said. All that stuff's done with. They outlawed it. Again, the ghost shook his head. A ghost is but a memory of what once was. And again he approached the walls. Kenny decided it would be better to change the subject. What's your name? He said. No answer. Mine's Kenny. Kenny Haldorf. I'd really like to know yours. The ghost stopped his searching and looked over his shoulder. Why? He asked. You know, to be your friend. Friend? Said the ghost, almost spitting out the word. Really, you can trust me. Come on, just tell me your name. For a moment, the ghost stared at Kenny. Then he said, Caleb, and turned back to the wall. Kenny watched him a while, trying to find a way to ask the question he wanted most to ask. Caleb, he said at last. The ghost turned to face him. Did you really get killed? Yes. Here in this room? Yes. Was it an accident? No. Did someone murder you? Yes. Who? I do not know. How come? I was asleep. Kenny swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry. Asleep? He managed to say. The ghost nodded. Do you know why you were killed? To keep me a slave. Kenny, who was feeling increasingly upset, said, Can you tell me more? They were making trouble for blacks. Who were? People. Why? We wanted to be free. And I tried to prevent them. When I did, I think they killed me. You said think. Does that mean you're not sure? No, I am not sure. Caleb turned back to the wall. Kenny said, well, can I, help you in some way? Caleb swung back around to face Kenny. He seemed incredulous, which means he didn't believe him. You? He said. Honest, I want to help. Caleb, with even more intensity, studied Kenny. And then he said, perhaps. Great. Just tell me how, Kenny insisted. I'll try, honest. The ghost continued to stare, as though trying to judge Kenny's words. Finally, he said, help me. Go on. Help me find my murderer. Kenny had a distinct feeling of shock. That's impossible, he protested. It must have happened a long time ago. And that is something which you know nothing about, do you? I've read some things. Read, said Caleb scornfully. But learn for yourself, Caleb said with growing anger. He pointed to the door, started to say something, but abruptly turned and once more began to search the walls. After a moment, Kenny said, Caleb, can I ask you some other stuff? The ghost paused only long enough to say, leave me. Kenny, not sure how he had offended the ghost, waited in hope that he would say more. When he didn't, when it was clear that he really was very angry, Kenny stepped into his own room, but it had completely changed. Don't forget to like and subscribe.